the monster. Across the street. My father grew up in a small suburban neighborhood in Ohio. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on, and where everyone knew each other by name. And right across the street from his childhood home lived Richard Wade Cooey. Richard was the same age as my father, but from a young age, it was clear that something was deeply wrong with him. My dad remembers him as a scrawny, red-headed troublemaker, always lurking around the neighborhood, watching, waiting. It started with small things that most people brushed off as boys being boys. Richard would spit on people as they walked by, shout obscenities at strangers, and destroy property just for the thrill of it. He was cruel in a way that didn't seem normal, even for a mischievous kid. Then he set a house on fire. The fire spread fast, devouring everything in its path. People panicked, scrambling to put it out before it could take down more homes. And when the authorities arrived, Richard stood there, grinning. And then he did something even worse. He blamed it all on a neighborhood kid with special needs. The boy was questioned, accused, and nearly arrested before someone finally realized the truth. But Richard, he never got into real trouble for it. His parents insisted it was a phase, that he was just acting out. They were wrong. Because what he did as a teenager was nothing compared to what he did when he was 19. By the time my father was in his sophomore year of college, he had all but forgotten about Richard Cooey. He was busy with classes, friends, and his future. Then, one day, the news broke. Richard and his friends, Clinton and Kenneth, had been hanging out near a local bridge, throwing massive chunks of concrete off the side, laughing as they watched them crash onto the highway below. Maybe it was just a game to them, or maybe they were hoping to kill someone. One of those concrete slabs smashed through a windshield. Inside the car were 21-year-old Wendy Ofo and her best friend, 20-year-old Dawn McCree, two young women who had just gotten off work at a local restaurant. They had their whole lives ahead of them, until they crossed paths with monsters. Kenneth, perhaps sensing that things were spiraling out of control, decided to go home. But Richard and Clinton weren't finished, not even close. The girls had pulled over, shaken and terrified. And that's when Richard and Clinton approached them. They put on friendly smiles, their voices smooth and comforting, playing the role of concerned young men. They offered to help, to give them a ride to safety. The girls hesitated, but ultimately, they accepted the ride. They didn't know. They couldn't have known. At first, Richard and Clinton took them to a shopping center. They acted casual, even kind. They told the girls to call their families and let them know they were okay. But that was just part of their plan, because the moment the girls let their parents know they were safe, the nightmare began. Richard and Clinton forced them back into the car. They tied their hands together. They drove them to an abandoned field behind the local mall. And then, for the next 3 agonizing hours, the girls endured something out of a horror film. They were beaten, tortured, stabbed. The men carved deep, jagged X's into their stomachs, marking them like trophies, as if they weren't even human. And then, when they were finished, they left them there, bleeding, dying, alone. But Richard and Clinton weren't done yet. No, these weren't just cold-blooded killers. They were greedy ones. They stripped Wendy and Dawn of their clothes, jewelry, and belongings. They planned to sell the items for extra cash, as if their victims were nothing more than disposable objects. But no one wanted to buy them. And that's when Richard made a mistake. Since he couldn't sell the girls' belongings, he decided to burn them in his backyard. But he didn't do it in secret. The flames roared in the middle of the night, waking up my grandparents. My grandfather, assuming it was just another one of Richard's disturbances, called the police again. That single phone call cracked the case wide open. By the time authorities arrived, Richard had already burned most of the evidence, but not all of it. Some of the items still had traces of blood, and Wendy's abandoned car was found soon after. Richard was arrested first, then Clinton. When they searched Clinton's pockets, they found a bloody pocket knife, the same one used to stab Wendy in the throat. The evidence was undeniable. These weren't just two reckless boys who made a mistake. They were predators. The trial was quick and brutal. Clinton, being only 17 at the time, was spared the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison. But Richard was not so lucky. The jury had no sympathy for him. The sheer evil of what he had done was undeniable. He was sentenced to death. And on October 14th, 2003, at 10 a.m., Richard Wade Cooey was executed by lethal injection. Wendy's family was present. They watched as the poison entered his veins, watched as his body stilled, watched as he took his final breath. And then, he was gone. Every time I visit my grandparents, I look across the street at the house where Richard Cooey grew up. It's just a house. It looks normal, ordinary. But I can't shake the feeling that something evil once lived there. And I am so glad I never met him. I'm even more grateful that my father was smart enough to never call him a friend. Because Richard wasn't just a bad kid, he was a monster. And I don't even want to think about how many other lives he might have ruined if he had never been caught. A warning from the shadows. Los Angeles was a dream, or at least that's what I told myself. When I moved here last year for law school, I was bursting with excitement. I had never lived in a big city before, let alone one with over 4 million people. Everything felt electric. The endless skyline, the hum of traffic, the sheer scale of it all. I was ready for adventure, for new beginnings. But there was something else lingering in the back of my mind, something I had spent my whole life ignoring. My half-sister. I had always known she existed. Ever since I was little, I was aware that I had a sister out there, somewhere, in this very city. But my parents never spoke about her, at least not in a way that made sense to me. Their voices would tighten at the mention of her name. My mother's eyes would darken. My father would change the subject, as if it physically pained him to talk about her. It was an unspoken rule in our house. She was off limits. A ghost. Of course, that didn't stop me from looking her up online. I knew what she looked like. I knew her name, where she went to college. But that was it. She was never particularly active on social media, so there wasn't much to go on. No real sense of who she was, just a handful of pictures and a digital footprint that barely existed. And then, out of nowhere, she reached out to me. One day during my first year of law school, I got a friend request on Facebook. From her. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. It was surreal. Her profile seemed legitimate. She had friends, photos, posts going back years. This was real. And then, a message popped up. She was inviting me to a small dinner party, in a park, with her friends. It felt like fate, the moment I had always wondered about, the chance to finally meet her. And yet, something gnawed at me, a strange, uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I was new to LA, still figuring out the city, and I had no idea which areas were safe or dangerous. But it wasn't just that. It was the setting. A park, at night, surrounded by strangers. I had imagined this moment so many times, but not like this. I had pictured something more intimate, more personal. A coffee shop, maybe, or a quiet afternoon walk. Not a public gathering where I'd have to share this deeply private reunion with people I didn't even know. What if we didn't get along? What if she was cold, distant, indifferent? Worse, what if we clicked, but then some small, careless comment turned the whole thing into a disaster? I could already imagine it. Voices rising, someone saying something they couldn't take back, tears welling up, spilling over. A scene. a mess. I didn't want to risk it, so I didn't go. I told myself I'd reach out later, arrange something one-on-one, somewhere quieter, somewhere that felt right. And for a while, that was the end of it. Until a few weeks later, when curiosity got the better of me. I decided to Google the park, just to see what it was like, to check if it could be a potential meeting spot for us in the future. What I found made my blood run cold. I won't say the name of the park, but anyone who has lived in Los Angeles long enough will know exactly the place I'm talking about. It's infamous, a hotspot for violent crime, a known gang territory. The kind of place where, if you're foolish enough to wander in at night, you might not come out. Even the criminals who operate there are forced to pay protection money to the local gang just to be left alone. And I was supposed to go there, alone, at night. Suddenly, that unease I had felt wasn't just anxiety, it was instinct. I needed answers. I needed to talk to my sister. I reached out to a friend who happened to go to the same college as her. I explained the situation and asked if they could track her down. A few days later, it finally happened. The three of us met at my friend's house. It was everything I had hoped for. We clicked instantly. No drama, no awkwardness, just laughter, conversation, and a genuine connection. We had dinner, watched a movie, and spent hours talking. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had a sister. And then I told her about the Facebook invite. She frowned, then her face went pale. She hadn't used Facebook since high school. Someone had been pretending to be her. I felt sick. I wanted to tell her to report the fake account, but when I went to check, it was already gone, deleted, erased, as if it had never existed. To this day, I still wonder, who sent that invite? What would have happened if I had gone? And most terrifying of all, how did they know exactly who I was? The stranger on bus 15. I was 15 when it happened. It was 1996, in my quiet hometown of about 100,000 people. I lived in the suburbs, but my high school was in the city. The bus was my lifeline. Every day, the same stops, the same routine. I never thought much about it. It was just part of life. That day, for some reason, I decided to change things up. Instead of waiting at my usual bus stop, I walked to the city's main bus station. Maybe I was just restless. Maybe I just wanted a change of scenery. But looking back, I wish I had never gone there. I stood at the gate where my bus, number 15, always departed. Another bus, number 17, also left from the same spot. As I waited, a man approached me. He looked to be in his 30s, maybe even 40s. His clothes were unremarkable, his face forgettable, but something about him felt off. "Hey, has bus 17 left already?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, I'm sorry. You just missed it." For a moment, I thought that would be the end of it. Just a random guy asking a random question. But then, instead of walking away, he stretched out his hand. "I'm Mark," he said. I hesitated. Why was a grown man introducing himself to a teenage girl at a bus station? But I didn't want to be rude, so I shook his hand. "I'm Maya," I lied. I don't know why I gave a fake name. Maybe something deep inside me already knew this situation was wrong. Mark kept talking. He asked if I had just finished school. I said yes. He asked what school I went to. I lied again. He asked if I was heading home. I said no, even though I was. Then my bus pulled up. Relief flooded through me as I climbed on, but to my horror, so did Mark. I knew for a fact he had been waiting for bus 17. He had literally asked me about it. If that was the bus he needed, why was he suddenly on mine? Bus 15 and bus 17 didn't share a single stop. There was no logical reason for him to be here. I sat down. He sat down right next to me. "Which year of high school are you in?" he asked. I lied again. "I'm a junior." In reality, I was just a freshman. He smiled, studying me. "You look too young to be a junior." I forced a laugh. "I hear that all the time." Then he asked if I had a boyfriend. I told him no. He frowned. "You should." I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on my backpack. Trying to keep my voice light, I asked, "So, where are you heading?" "Home," he said casually. That didn't make sense. "Weren't you waiting for bus 17? I asked. He shook his head. "Nah, I live at the very last stop on bus 15. That was a lie. I had been riding bus 15 for years. I had never seen him before. Then he asked me again if I was going home. I lied one more time. "No, I'm visiting a friend." I was sure he believed me. I thought I had the situation under control. But when my stop came, I hesitated. I didn't want him to see where I lived. I didn't want him to follow me home. So I stayed on the bus, waiting for the next stop. To my horror, Mark got off with me. I tried to act natural. "Oh, where are you going now?" "I'll walk you home," he said, smiling. My stomach dropped. "No, really. You don't have to," I said quickly. His smile vanished. His voice turned sharp. "Shut up and walk." We were alone now. The street was empty, just me and him. Something inside me screamed, "Run!" But I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in a moment where everything felt unreal, like I had stepped into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. 1 second ago, he had been a weird, chatty stranger. Now his face had changed. His eyes were cold, his body tense. I had no idea what to do. And then, the man on bus 15. I went from feeling like I had control to realizing in one horrifying moment that I had really messed up. Mark's hand clamped down on my shoulder, his grip firm, but not tight. Yet, he leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear. "I don't have much time," he said, "so we should get going." My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, but my body refused to move. I wanted to snap back at him, tell him he clearly had all the time in the world if he had followed me off the bus. But I didn't. I didn't want to make him angrier than he already seemed. So I just nodded. His fingers pressed slightly into my shoulder. "If you're good, you don't have to be scared of me." I swallowed hard. "I'm not scared," he smirked. "Does that mean you plan on being good?" I nodded again. "Say it," he ordered. I hesitated. "Say it," he repeated, his voice sharper now. "Yes," I whispered. "I will be good." Satisfied, he gave my shoulder a slight pat. "Good girl. Now walk." I started moving, my legs stiff, my brain on fire. I had no idea where I was going. I just walked. He walked beside me, his hand still on my shoulder. I was never a religious person. I had never even prayed before. But in that moment, I was begging whatever higher power existed to keep me from passing out. My heart was pounding so fast, my breath shallow and ragged. I was sure I was about to collapse. Then, up ahead, I saw an old man tending to his garden in front of a house. It's the last thing I clearly remember. I have a vague memory of running, of my own voice screaming, of the old man turning, startled. Mark ran off. The old man called the police. They contacted my parents, but the police couldn't do anything. They took my statement, but since no crime had technically been committed, there was nothing they could charge him with. My parents, realizing how serious this was, bought me a new phone that very same day. This was the 90s, back when mobile phones were still a luxury. But they didn't care. They just wanted me to be able to call for help if I ever needed it. I wish the story ended there. For weeks, I was extra careful. I only ever took the bus from the stop directly in front of my school. I tried to push what had happened out of my mind, telling myself it was over, that I was safe. And then, one day, I stepped onto the bus and locked eyes with Mark. He was sitting in one of the seats near the front, and as soon as he saw me, his face lit up. His mouth stretched into the biggest grin, like he was thrilled to see me again. My stomach flipped. My hands went ice cold. I turned and got off the bus immediately, bolting back into my school. My body was shaking as I pulled out my phone and called my mom in tears. She told me to find a teacher and wait inside until she arrived. After that, my school was officially notified of what was going on, and it only got worse. Mark was seen multiple times hanging around the school. Sometimes he would appear several days in a row. Other times he wouldn't be seen for weeks. But he always came back. The police, once again, were useless. "We can't do anything unless he actually hurts you," they said, "unless he shows up on school property or at your home." So for the rest of the school year, I never left campus alone. I waited inside the building until my mom could pick me up after work. Every day, she took a different route home. At the time, I didn't understand why. Now I do. She was making sure we weren't being followed. I don't know if Mark ever figured out my real name. I don't think he ever found out where I lived. And thankfully, he was never spotted in my neighborhood. And then one day he was just gone. Years passed. Life went on. I was 21 when I saw him again. I was home for summer break from university, shopping at a grocery store in a completely different part of town. I was walking down an aisle when I saw him. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me, but I recognized him instantly. The moment I saw his face, my entire body reacted. My chest tightened, my stomach churned, my skin crawled. But he didn't even glance my way. I don't know if he had forgotten me, or if he was just pretending. Where I live, there's no public criminal registry. Cases like mine aren't reported. I never found out Mark's full name. I have no idea who he was. I have no idea what he's done since then. And worst of all, I have no idea what he would have done to me that night if I hadn't run. My personal theory: he was mentally unstable. He saw me, liked me, and decided I was his. My mother, though, she believes it was something much darker, that it wasn't random, that he knew exactly what he was doing. My dad, he never talks about it. And honestly, I don't think I ever want to know the full truth. I'm just grateful he's out of my life. For good.